The valley where I lived wasn't just another piece of land. It was history, legacy, and a sanctuary that had been in my family for nearly a century. The lake at the center of it wasn't man-made by some government project or contractor. It was hand-carved by my grandfather and great-uncles in the 1930s. They built the dam with their bare hands, stone by stone, timber hauled by horse-drawn wagons, and sweat that stained every rock. What started as a way to trap enough water for farming grew into a wide, shimmering lake. Families from nearby towns fished there, swam there, and in the fall, the water reflected the fiery colors of the maples like a mirror from another world. But this wasn't just about heritage. The bridge across that lake was essential. It connected my cabin, barns, and cattle pastures to the county road. Without it, you'd have to drive an extra 40 minutes around the mountain to reach the same spot. The bridge was old, yes, but I kept it repaired, reinforced, and perfectly functional. And most importantly, it was mine. On my land. When the HOA came into the picture, they pretended as if the whole valley was theirs to command. A group of self-important suburban transplants who thought buying vacation homes around my grandfather's lake gave them authority over everything. They called themselves the Lakeside Community Association, but I called them what they really were, nosy, power-drunk opportunists. And the ringleader of it all? You guessed it, Karen. Not just any Karen, but the kind who carried a clipboard like it was a weapon and spoke as if she'd been elected President of the United States instead of a neighborhood committee. At first, it was little things. Notices stuffed into my mailbox claiming my cattle were too noisy, even though my ranch predated their homes by nearly 80 years. Complaints about unauthorized water use when I irrigated my own fields. And then, the HOA had the audacity to claim that the bridge across my lake violated community safety standards. They weren't content to control their own cul-de-sacs. They wanted my bridge gone. One morning, I woke to the sound of machinery echoing across the lake. Heavy diesel engines, chains rattling, and the unmistakable shriek of metal against wood. I sprinted down the trail, heart pounding. And when I reached the shore, my blood ran cold. There they were, contractors in neon vests. A backhoe perched like a vulture at the water's edge, ripping apart the bridge my grandfather had built. HOA board members stood smugly nearby, Karen in the center, sunglasses perched on her nose, sipping a latte like she was watching a show. "You can't be serious," I shouted, my boots slamming against the dirt as I stormed toward them. "This is my bridge. My property." "You have no right," Karen interrupted me with a smirk that could have curdled milk. Actually, according to our safety review, the structure was deemed hazardous. The association voted and removal was approved. "You should thank us. We just saved you from a lawsuit." The backhoe's bucket tore another beam free, the sound like a gunshot to my ears. Rage built inside me, hot and electric, but I kept my composure. Losing my temper here wouldn't help. Not yet. "You'll regret this," I said quietly, my fist clenched so tight my knuckles cracked. "You have no idea what you're playing with." Karen tilted her head and smiled the way a cat does when it corners a mouse. "Oh, sweetie," she purred. "The lake belongs to everyone now. Maybe it's time you learned to share." That was the moment something inside me shifted. They thought they had power. They thought destroying my bridge meant they could own me, control me. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that I controlled something much bigger. Because while they were busy sipping cocktails at their $4 million resort on the far shore, a place they'd built to attract wealthy tourists, I held the keys to the one thing that made it all possible, the dam. My grandfather's dam wasn't just a relic. It was still fully functional, reinforced with concrete over the years, with a massive steel floodgate that controlled the entire water level of the lake. Without it, the lakefront homes would be fronting nothing but a muddy crater. The fancy resort would lose its sparkling attraction, its docks would sit in the dirt, and their Lakeside Community Association would become just another overpriced subdivision in the mountains. As I stood there watching them destroy my bridge, the plan began to crystallize. They thought they had stripped me of power, but in truth, they had just handed me the perfect excuse. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten again. I simply turned on my heel, walked back up the trail, and by the time I reached the cabin, my mind was set like steel. If they wanted war, I'd show them what real war looked like. That night, I sat at my grandfather's desk, the dam blueprints spread before me. I traced the old notes he had scribbled in the margins decades ago. He had always told me, "This lake is a gift, but never forget, it can also be a weapon." For years, I had respected the lake as a gift. But now, thanks to the HOA, it was time to remind them of the other side. The night after they tore down my bridge, I barely slept. The sound of the backhoe tearing beams from the water still echoed in my head. Every creak of wood, every splash of timber falling into the lake felt like a betrayal of my family's legacy. My golden retriever, Duke, rested his head on my knee as if he knew the storm brewing in my chest. I wasn't going to let the HOA win. Not Karen, not their smug little committee, and certainly not the resort owners who had been feeding their arrogance. The first step was recon. Before you fight an enemy, you understand their position. So just before sunrise, I hopped on my ATV and took the long trail around the mountain to the far side of the lake. That detour took nearly an hour, thanks to my bridge being gone, but it gave me time to think. When I arrived, I parked behind a thicket of pines and watched. The resort sat gleaming in the early morning light, all glass decks and manicured lawns. Fancy dock boats rocked lazily on the water, and workers were already setting up breakfast buffets for wealthy tourists who thought they were experiencing the rustic outdoors. I almost laughed. These people paid thousands to sip champagne by a lake that my grandfather built with his hands. Closer to the shoreline, I noticed something else. HOA board members mingling with resort staff, laughing, shaking hands. Deals were being made. It was clear as day. The HOA wasn't just meddling for safety reasons. They were in bed with the resort. The bridge removal was step one. Step two would have been claiming easements or slapping me with lawsuits until I caved. Eventually, they'd push me out entirely, buy my land at a fraction of its worth, and claim the whole valley for themselves. They didn't just underestimate me. They disrespected generations of blood, sweat, and grit, and for that, I was about to make them pay. On the ride back, my decision solidified. The dam was mine. It had always been mine. And draining the lake wasn't just symbolic, it would cripple them where it hurt most, their wallets. That evening, I drove down to the dam. It wasn't some modern facility with computer panels and alarms. It was old school, thick steel floodgates, heavy cranks, and gears that required muscle to turn. Over the years, I had maintained it, greased the machinery, kept the structure solid. And as I ran my hands over the cold steel, I realized how easy it would be. Just a few turns, and the water level would drop, but I wasn't reckless. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about making a statement. I wanted them to know exactly who had done this and why. So I began preparing. First, I set up cameras around the dam. If anyone accused me of negligence, I'd have proof of what I did and why. Next, I wrote a letter to the HOA and the resort, documenting their illegal destruction of my property, the bridge. I sealed it in an envelope, ready to be mailed the second I opened the floodgates. If they wanted to escalate legally, fine. I wasn't afraid of a courtroom. But by then, the damage would already be done. The following days were filled with small acts of patience. I visited the resort again, this time blending in among the tourists. They were bragging about a summer festival planned for the lake, canoe races, fireworks, a weekend of high-paying guests that would rake in millions. Perfect. The timing couldn't have been better. Meanwhile, Karen strutted around the neighborhood like she had won some great victory. She even stopped me one morning when I was walking Duke, flashing a smug grin. "Enjoying the long drive around?" she asked sweetly. "Maybe it's time you considered selling. Life could be so much easier without all this inconvenience." I stared at her for a long moment, every ounce of restraint keeping me from laughing in her face. Instead, I simply said, "You'll see, Karen. You'll see soon enough." She chuckled, flipping her sunglasses back onto her nose. Empty threats don't scare me. Oh, but she had no idea. Finally, the weekend of the festival arrived. The resort was buzzing with activity, banners strung across docks, jet skis roaring across the water, music drifting over the lake. HOA board members wore smug smiles, sipping cocktails on the patio, already counting their money. That night, under cover of darkness, I put the plan into motion. I drove down to the dam with Duke riding shotgun, his head out the window as if he sensed something important was happening. The moonlight glinted off the steel gates and the air was heavy with anticipation. I strapped on my gloves, set up my cameras, and took one last look at the still waters of the lake. Soon, those waters would be gone, sucked downstream into the Valley River, leaving nothing but mud and empty docks behind. With a grunt, I grabbed the massive crank wheel and began to turn. At first it resisted, stiff from decades of holding steady, but slowly it gave way, squealing like a beast waking from slumber. The gears clanked, the steel groaned, and then I heard it, the rush of water roaring through the floodgates. It started slow, a trickle that quickly grew into a torrent. The lake surface rippled as the water level began to drop. By morning, the change would be impossible to ignore. As I worked the crank, Duke barked at the echoing roar, tail wagging like he knew this was victory. My chest burned with adrenaline, my muscles ached from the effort, but I didn't stop until the gates were fully open. I stepped back, sweat dripping down my face, and watched the current surge into the valley below. The lake was draining. The resort's lifeline was bleeding out, and there wasn't a thing they could do to stop it. I leaned against the railing, breathing hard, and let out a laugh that came from somewhere deep inside. The HOA wanted war. Now they had it. By dawn, the sound of rushing water echoed through the valley like a giant heartbeat. I barely slept that night, but I didn't need to. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the smug faces of Karen and her HOA board, sipping wine at the resort while congratulating themselves for tearing down my bridge. The thought of their expressions when they realized what was happening kept me wide awake. At first light, I took Duke down to the lake shore. The transformation was already striking. The waterline had dropped by several feet, leaving docks hanging in the air like broken teeth. Fish flopped desperately in the shrinking shallows, and boats that had once floated proudly now sat tilted in the mud. Duke sniffed around, tail wagging, as if the chaos unfolding before us was just another morning adventure. But the real show was on the other side. I grabbed my binoculars and watched the resort. Workers rushed back and forth along the shoreline, pointing, shouting, trying to keep up with the disaster. Guests in expensive swimwear stood on balconies with coffee cups in hand, staring in disbelief as the pristine lakefront view they'd paid thousands for turned into a muddy crater. And then I spotted them, the HOA board. Karen, dressed in a bright pink tracksuit that looked more suited for a fashion runway than the mountains, was on her phone, pacing furiously. Two other board members flanked her, gesturing wildly toward the water. Even from this distance, I could tell they were panicking. I decided to make my presence known. After breakfast, I saddled up my ATV and took the long detour around to the resort. I parked casually at the edge of their precious festival grounds and walked straight into the chaos. No one stopped me. They were too busy shouting over each other, tourists demanding refunds, staff running around with buckets as if that would refill an entire lake. Karen spotted me almost instantly. Her face went pale, then red, then pale again, like a traffic light on overdrive. She stormed toward me, phone still pressed to her ear. "You!" she screeched, pointing a manicured finger. "What did you do?" I raised an eyebrow and pretended innocence. "Morning, Karen, trouble in paradise?" "Don't play dumb with me!" she snapped, her voice cracking. "The lake, it's disappearing, all of it. This entire resort depends on it, and it's your fault." I crossed my arms, enjoying every second of the unraveling spectacle. "Funny, last I checked, you all were pretty eager to tell me the lake belonged to everyone. So, if it belongs to everyone, why am I the one you're yelling at?" Her jaw worked furiously, but before she could answer, another board member, a balding man with a too-tight polo, ran over, panic etched across his face. "Karen, the docks are useless. Boats are grounded. Guests are demanding refunds. We'll lose hundreds of thousands by the end of the day if this doesn't stop." Karen shot me a glare that could have melted steel. "Call the sheriff," she hissed into her phone. Right now, there it was. Their trump card. Or so they thought. Within the hour, a pair of sheriff's cruisers pulled up, lights flashing. Officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts, scanning the chaos. Karen practically threw herself at them, her voice shrill and dramatic. "Arrest him!" she shouted, pointing at me. "He sabotaged the dam. He's destroying our property!" The deputies exchanged looks, then turned to me. "Sir, is there truth to these claims?" I smiled calmly, pulling a thick folder from my jacket. "Actually, officers, there's something you should see." Inside the folder were copies of my land deeds, dating back nearly 100 years, clearly marking the lake, the bridge, and, most importantly, the dam as part of my property. Not community land. Not resort-owned. Mine. The deputies flipped through the papers, nodding slowly. One of them looked up at Karen, his expression flat. "Ma'am, from what I'm seeing here, this gentleman owns the dam outright. He's within his legal rights to manage water flow as he sees fit." Karen's face contorted. "What? That's absurd! He's ruining everything. Our property values will plummet. The resort will—" "Ma'am," the deputy interrupted, holding up a hand. "Property value disputes are civil matters, not criminal. Unless you have evidence of a crime, there's nothing we can do here." It was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Karen's jaw dropped, and for once she had no comeback. As the deputies walked back to their cruisers, I leaned close enough for her to hear me over the chaos. "I warned you, Karen. You destroyed my bridge, so I drained your lake." "That's called balance." Her eyes widened with pure fury. You can't do this." "We'll sue you. We'll take everything you have," I chuckled, shaking my head. "You can try. But until then, I'd suggest investing in a good pair of boots. Looks like your lakefront view is nothing but mud now." Around us, the chaos escalated. Resort managers barked orders, guests packed their bags, and the once bustling festival of the lake dissolved into a circus of anger and disappointment. The HOA board huddled together frantic, but I didn't stay to listen. I'd made my point, and now I wanted to watch them squirm from the comfort of my porch. On the ride back, Duke sat proudly in the ATV, tongue lolling, as if he knew we'd just won a battle. And truthfully, we had, but the war wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. She'd double down, dig in, and try to find another angle. But that was fine, because I wasn't finished either. The dam had more to give, and if the HOA thought they'd seen the worst of me, they were about to learn just how deep my resolve ran. The next few days were like watching a slow-motion train wreck. The resort, once the jewel of the valley, had become a disaster zone. With the lake drained, their carefully staged photos on travel websites looked like a cruel joke. Instead of sparkling blue water, guests were greeted with cracked mud flats, dead fish, and half-sunken docks sticking up like gravestones. Tourists demanded refunds, weddings canceled, fishing tournaments relocated. By the end of the week, the resort was bleeding money faster than they could count it. And Karen? She was unraveling. From my porch, binoculars in hand, I watched her storm around the resort grounds, her shrill voice carrying even across the empty lake bed. She called emergency meetings with the board, called contractors, even tried hiring a water trucking company to refill the lake. But when she saw the estimate, millions of dollars for a temporary fix, her confidence cracked like glass. I could have left it there. Victory was already mine, but Karen wasn't done, and neither was I. 3 days later, a courier truck pulled up my dirt driveway. Inside was a thick envelope stamped with the HOA's official seal. I opened it at the kitchen table while Duke lay at my feet, wagging his tail as if sensing more entertainment. It was a lawsuit. They were suing me for willful destruction of community property and malicious interference with business interests. Karen's name was scribbled proudly at the bottom, as if she believed she'd finally found the weapon to crush me. I laughed so hard I had to set the papers down. Did she really not understand? The following week, we met in county court. Karen arrived in heels far too high for the courthouse steps, flanked by 2 board members and a high-priced lawyer who looked more like a model than an attorney. They strutted in with smug confidence, certain the law would bend to their will. I showed up in jeans, boots, and a weathered leather jacket, carrying only my folder of land deeds and a binder thick with photographs, receipts, and legal documents that went back generations. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with sharp glasses and an even sharper glare, opened the proceedings. Karen's lawyer launched into a dramatic speech about how I had single-handedly destroyed the community's most precious resource and caused irreparable harm to dozens of families and businesses. When it was my turn, I stood calmly, opened my folder, and began. Your Honor, the HOA claims I destroyed property that was not theirs. But as these deeds show, the lake, the dam, and everything surrounding it are fully within the boundaries of my ranch. My family has owned this land for nearly a century. The HOA has no legal claim to it. I handed the judge the documents. She skimmed them, her brow furrowing. The room went silent except for the shuffle of paper. And furthermore, I continued, pulling out photographs of my demolished bridge. The HOA trespassed on my property, destroyed my private bridge, and endangered my livestock by blocking my access across the lake. These damages are documented and reported. If anyone here has a case, Your Honor, it's me. Karen shot to her feet. That's a lie. He's twisting everything. That bridge was— Sit down, Mrs. Holloway, the judge snapped. You'll speak when I address you. Karen froze, her face reddening, but she obeyed. Her lawyer tried to recover, flipping through his notes, but the damage was done. The judge spent another 10 minutes reviewing my evidence before setting the papers down with finality. It's clear to this court, she said firmly, that the lake and dam are private property belonging to the defendant. The plaintiff, the HOA, had no right to interfere, and in fact appears to have committed property damage against the defendant. Case dismissed. The gavel came down. Just like that. Karen gasped, nearly collapsing back into her chair. Her lawyer looked like someone had just told him his yacht sank. The board members whispered frantically, their faces pale. I stood, tipped my hat politely, and walked out. But I wasn't finished. 2 weeks later, after filing my own countersuit for damages, I received a settlement offer. The HOA, desperate to avoid a drawn-out battle they knew they'd lose, offered to pay for the reconstruction of my bridge, plus a hefty sum in damages. I accepted, but with a twist. Instead of rebuilding the bridge, I used the money to make permanent changes to the dam. With the help of engineers, I installed a gated spillway that allowed me to control the water flow however I wanted, which meant whenever the HOA got too loud, too nosy, or too smug, I could lower the gates and remind them who really controlled the valley. The best part? With the resort bankrupt and closed within months, the HOA lost its biggest source of revenue. Homeowners fled, property values tanked, and the once proud HOA became a shadow of itself. One evening, as Duke and I sat on the rebuilt porch overlooking the trickle of what used to be their million-dollar view, I saw Karen driving away for the last time. Her luxury SUV was packed to the brim, her face pale and drawn. She didn't even glance at my ranch as she sped off down the road. I raised a glass of bourbon in silent victory. This valley's ours again, Duke, I said, patting his head. No HOA, no board, no Karen, just us and the land. The way it was meant to be, Duke barked once, tail thumping against the porch, and with the sun setting over the mountains, casting the drained lake in shades of gold and fire, I realized I'd done more than win. I'd reminded them all of a simple truth. You don't mess with a man on his own land, especially not when that man owns the dam.